Welcome to the ENCORE Learning Story Gathering tutorial. This 15-minute video was created to assist ENCORE Learning member volunteers in preparing for the Martin Luther King (MLK) Volunteer Day Oral History Project to be held on January 20th, 2020. This activity is focused on a 1 to 1.5 hours conversation pairing an ENCORE volunteer with a resident of one of the Arlington Assisted Living Facilities. The purpose of the activity is to have a conversation with a resident that could form a basis of a story about a significant memory. This video was created in order to provide the ENCORE volunteer with methods and questions to facilitate a conversation. It is likely the ENCORE volunteer may have help from a GMU student or faculty member, perhaps for note-taking or other help in stimulating conversation.
The main rule is to be flexible. While we must follow ethical guidelines in doing oral history, there are no firm rules for conducting an interview. There is no ideal interview. Each person that you interview will be unique. Each interview you conduct will be like no other conversation you ever had. This handout is designed as a guideline and should not be considered the final word. The objective of doing an oral history interview is to record the greatest amount of personally significant and historically accurate information as possible. In this session, we will cover the 5 steps in doing oral history: getting started and setting up the interview, interview preparation, recording the interview, utilizing good interview techniques, the final product. Getting started and setting up the interview. The normal process for setting up an interview for an oral history involves the following steps. Think about who you want to interview and why. Decide on a strategy to make first contact. Make first contact by letter or by telephone if possible. Give the person an overview of what you hope to accomplish and a general idea of the questions you will be asking. Schedule the first interview session at a time and place that is convenient for the narrator as soon after the initial contact as possible. ENCORE Learning will have accomplished these steps before the project date. We have set up the volunteer storyteller, identified the location and timing, and our plan is to publish stories in local newspapers. The next slides will focus on what you need to do to prepare. Preparing for the interview. Before doing the interview, you should, if possible, get some information about the storyteller's background and general life experience. ENCORE Learning will try to get this information before the interview date. Of course, it may not be possible to learn a great deal about the person in advance. However, if you are interviewing a former civil rights activist, you will want to have a good background on the history of civil rights in Arlington. The purpose of this is to be able to frame intelligent questions to ask during the interview. For example, if you are interviewing a World War II veteran who served as a pilot in the Pacific Theater, refreshing your memory of history will help you frame better questions as well as develop an understanding of the story the narrator is telling. In addition, this knowledge will alert the person you are interviewing that you care enough about the history to take some extra time to research it. If you are interviewing folks who have lived in a neighborhood in Arlington for the last 60 years, you can use Arlington history books, maps, and newspapers to get a better idea of what changes the neighborhood has gone through over the decades. Create a list of at least 10 sample interview questions. Develop some open-ended questions such as, what was your community like growing up? Could you describe the process you went through in deciding to move to this area to work? What have been some of the challenges you have faced in coming to the United States? An open-ended question gives the narrator space to answer a question at length on their own terms. In contrast, closed-ended questions are designed to get one-line responses. What year were you born? How many people lived in your house growing up? Do you like working here? Sometimes you need to get basic information regarding names and dates. Closed-ended questions are appropriate. However, if you ask too many closed-ended questions, you will begin to get a string of one-line responses, yes or no, during the interview. Think about how you might structure your questions in such a way that your narrator will feel comfortable with talking more expansively. For example, instead of asking, "Do you like working here?" try, "How does working here compare with your other work experiences?" Remember, an oral history interview is not a job interview. Recording the interview. How can we be certain after the interview that we have really captured the essence of what the narrator was trying to tell us? Handwritten notes are good, but not nearly as accurate or dependable as the recorded interview. People are very hesitant to allow their voices to be recorded, and for good reason. I have found, however, that I've been able to convince most of the people that I've tried to interview that a recording will be more faithful as a rendition of their thoughts and life history than my hastily scribbled written notes. Step 1 is to select a good recorder. We are recommending use of the StoryCorps app for iPhone and Android. It is easy to use and has features that even allow you to upload the story to the Library of Congress. Step 2, practice using your equipment before your interview. Do a mock interview with a friend. Become familiar with the specific workings of the machine, including the steps necessary to begin and stop the recorder. Point the microphone at the speaker, bottom edge of the smartphone. Record yourself talking and make some mental notes on how far the recorder should be placed between the interviewer and the narrator to ensure optimal sound quality. The YouTube video on the next slide introduces the StoryCorps app. Good interviewing techniques getting started. The success of the interview depends to a great degree on the amount of trust and understanding the interviewer can create with the narrator. Courtesy and empathy are a part of this process. As you start to do oral history interviews, you will begin to understand the importance of doing background research. You will also begin to pick up on other intangible gestures and personality traits that make for a good interview. When you arrive to begin the interview, set up your smartphone app as soon as possible. As you are getting set up, give another general overview of the types of things you are interested in, as well as some questions you might ask. If the person begins talking about their life history before you can start recording, so much the better. This means that they have already broken the ice, so to speak. If this is the case, you might be able to start the interview by saying, "Mrs. Jones, you were telling about the reasons your family left Florida for Arlington. Can you tell me about this again now that the recorder is running?" Start the interview by asking an open-ended question that the narrator will be able to answer easily, at length. An open-ended question could be, "Could you tell me about what your community was like when you were growing up?" Do not interrupt the narrator during the first part of their testimony, even if relevant information to your interests is being passed over. Make notes of questions that arise out of the narrator's narrative. Demonstrate a strong interest in what the narrator is saying. Obtain respectful eye contact. Convey interest by facial expressions and the kinds of gestures you normally use when you are interested in what somebody is telling you. Be alert for topics that should be expanded upon later, or hints given by the narrator of a desire to be asked to discuss in-depth points merely alluded to. Listen carefully and pay attention that your subsequent questions do not deal with information already adequately covered by the narrator. Be mentally structuring new questions that should be covered. Make notes on your scratch pad so that you will not miss valuable information. If the narrator pauses, do not ask a new question until you're certain that he or she is not simply reflecting. Good interviewing techniques. The interview. As the interview proceeds, follow the same general pattern of asking open-ended questions. Be intensely involved in the interview, but avoid offering your own judgments. The more you offer your own opinions, the more chances you run into offending the narrator and shutting down the interview entirely. If you're trying to find out what this person thinks, you already know your own opinions. After the narrator has overcome initial shyness, you may want to ask questions that clarify specific points they made earlier. This is where the close-ended questions become more effective. Try to place the interview within a historical context by seeking information regarding who, what, when, where, how. That is, dates, places, and examples to build on the narrator's statements. For example, Mrs. Jones, you said earlier that times were so tough when you were in Florida. When you said you were in Florida, we had rough times. Were you referring only to your family, or did you mean that everyone in the state was having a rough time? If the narrator first suggests it, encourage them to bring out a family photo album or heirloom that helps them to remember more clearly. Always keep the issue of confidentiality in mind. If the person relates information that could potentially harm their job or immigration status, it is your duty to warn them that in oral history there is no such thing as lawyer-client privilege, and that interviews can be subpoenaed by courts. It is appropriate to erase parts of a recording that contain sensitive information before turning it over to a library or archive. If there is an apparent contradiction in the narrator's narrative, do not hesitate to point out the contradictions by approaching them simply as something that needs clarification. If you have questions that you feel are of a sensitive nature, wait until you have established trust with the narrator before you ask them. Remind the narrator that any part of their testimony may be deemed confidential if they wish. If the narrator, when asked about a certain event, requests that you turn off the recorder, do so. Always thank the persons you are interviewing for their time and efforts. Being interviewed is mentally and spiritually demanding. Narrators may become deeply moved as they recount certain parts of their lives. They may even openly weep. If this is your responsibility, to show much empathy as you can during these moments of spiritual anguish. Be flexible. The following slide is an example of an interview.
What was the biggest change about you from Vietnam?
I was not really worried anymore about being socially acceptable. From the day I got out, I didn't shave or cut my hair for probably a year. And people that I knew before I left, even some of my cousins, didn't think too much of me after I got back. So I took a long bicycle trip.
Went off and got by yourself.
Yeah. I rode straight north up through Minnesota, cut across, and rode all the way to the West Coast. Took me about 6 weeks.
Do you think that you sort of healed from Vietnam on that trip?
It helped a lot. But really, I actually didn't heal from Vietnam till quite a number of years later. I had a janitorial business, and I was doing floors at Sears. And they had a Vietnam movie on there. And something just broke. And I cried. I sobbed like a baby for a couple hours. While I was finishing them floors, just sobbed like a baby. Because it was several good friends I lost. It's just too much devastation that I saw there. Just too much hurt. And I really didn't plan on coming back.
I'm glad you came back.
Yeah. Me too. Me too.
Thinking about the final product. The ENCORE learning intent is to develop a series of oral histories suitable for publication in local newspapers. Dependent upon the quality of interviews, we intend to submit the interview recordings to the Library of Congress. Always ask the narrator if you'd like a copy of the audio resulting from the interview. This concludes this tutorial.